changes will be considered to give religious groups greater freedom to discriminate by safeguarding them from key areas of the law. The Australian reports Cabinet will meet today to consider ways to ban discrimination on the basis of faith in areas such as employment, housing and some services. The idea would provide protections for faith-based schools, potentially allowing them to hire and fire staff based on religion. Senior Catholic figures are calling for any changes to be positive to protect religious freedom as a universal human right. It wants the government to go a step further to recognise religious rights in law rather than provide exemptions. Greens MP Adam Bandt says the proposal to change religious freedoms is just a promise to the hard right.
This came out of the marriage equality debate. It's an attack on equality. It was a promise to the hard right of the Liberal and National parties that some of the freedoms that were and equality that was granted in the marriage equality debate would in some respect be wound back. And so we're very concerned about the legislation. When you say that they're trying to walk a fine line, in part that difficulty comes because they've made a promise to the right-wing rump to start winding back some freedoms.
Well, let's go live now to Liberal MP Tim Wilson, just the hard right rump of your party apparently. What do you say to that?
Well, Adam Bandt is absolutely delusional. He doesn't understand that we have a Federal Race Discrimination Act, a Federal Sex Discrimination Act, a Federal Disability Discrimination Act and a Federal Age Discrimination Act, and what we're saying is we're going to introduce a Federal Religious Discrimination Act.
OK, well, what protections do religious institutions need and deserve?
Well, these are the sorts of things that are being considered as part of the process, but it's not an outrageous proposition that religious institutions should be able to decide, for instance, in some religious activities that only people of their faith should be able to be a participant in it. In fact, that's basically how the law works at a state level, and in practice it works at a federal level as well. It's pretty straightforward.
But isn't that's the complaint at the moment? There's the state-based jurisdictions and bodies that are the problem here, and as you just listed, there are a number of competing interests. So when they do compete in individual cases, what wins? That's not clear, is it?
Well, it depends on the scope of each bit of legislation, but as a broad proposition, what we want to do is make sure that people aren't discriminated against on the basis of their religion in basic civic functions. I don't think people applying for jobs should be discriminated against simply because they're Jewish. I don't believe that people seeking to access housing should be discriminated against because they're Catholic. I don't believe that when you go and join many community-based organisations, you should be discriminated against because they're Muslim. And I also don't think it's outside the scope of what most mainstream Australians think to say that should be unlawful as well.
But what about a gay teacher working at a religious school? How does that one work out?
Well, that's covered by the Sex Discrimination Act at the moment, and we've referred that to the Australian Law Reform Commission to look at ways to amend legislation, because currently religious institutions can discriminate against children as well as teachers in schools and a number of other people in faith-based institutions. We've said we think that the current law is past its use-by date, and we're looking at reform. But my understanding is that that will not be covered in this piece of legislation, despite the hysteria of people like Adam Bandt. OK, let's look at IR changes now. You and two other of your colleagues are calling for changes. You're doing that within the government apparatus at the moment. You've talked about unfair dismissal laws and your willingness to change them. What do you want to change, and do you accept that there is fertile ground for a scare campaign here? Well, today the member for Mackellar, Jason Falinski, Senator Andrew Bragg and myself wrote a pretty straightforward opinion piece in the Australian Financial Review, which said simply this: here is the test that Julia Gillard set for the Fair Work Act around enterprise agreements and unfair dismissal, basically saying we want people to be able to use enterprise bargaining. We want people or small businesses not to face problems around unfair dismissal. And the practical reality is it failed its own test. We're using her test, not ours. And that's the basis in which some of us are saying we need to relook at industrial relations laws, because Julia Gillard says Australia's IR laws have failed. Does the Prime Minister have a sympathetic ear? Well, I haven't had that conversation with the Prime Minister, but when you show a mirror up to Julia Gillard's own words, when you show a mirror up and the test that Julia Gillard established shows that Australia's industrial relations laws have failed, her industrial relations laws have failed, I would have thought that just about anybody who has an independent thought would go accept the fact that Australia's industrial relations laws have failed. They've failed workers, they've failed small business, and we're simply arguing that there should be a consideration around reform to make it easier to hire people and pay better paying wages.
Look, Labor argues that you're trying to wind back protections for workers at a time when they haven't seen a bump in their wages for quite some time. They're finding it hard to make ends meet. And once again, you're on the side of business. Is that true?
Well, the first thing our article argues for is employing more people and paying higher wages. So I don't think they've actually read it. Our focus is how do we pay higher wages and get more people employed, and we use Julia Gillard's own test about the success of her own laws, and what it shows is that it has failed, and that's the basis in which we're arguing for reform to pay higher wages and employ more people.
Reform this term?
Well, we're making the case why the law should be reformed, and yes, we're always keen to see reforms considered in this term of Parliament. But you know, I think they have to be proportionate, they have to be measured. We have to take the community with them, with us, and I've made that case at every point.
The Deputy Prime Minister, Michael McCormack, has made comments in recent days saying the Pacific will survive climate change because of, one, Australian jobs and Australian fruit picking. Now, I don't wish to verbal the Deputy Prime Minister, so let's just have a quick listen to what he had to say exactly.
They'll continue to survive because many of their workers come here and pick our fruit grown with hard Australian enterprise and endeavour, and we welcome them. We always will. But the fact is we're not going to be hijacked into doing something that is going to shut down an industry that provides tens of thousands of workers' jobs.
You're not his press secretary, Tim Wilson. I accept
that. No, I'm
not. But do you see what he's trying to say here?
Yeah, I think what he's trying to say is exactly what the Prime Minister has been saying, which is that the job of the Australian government is to defend Australia's national interest. We provide enormous opportunities, obviously, for our own citizens, but for many Pacific Island nations and their citizens to be able to be employed in Australia. And we have to make sure that when we're dealing with things like climate change policy, that we take sensible, proportionate action, we take the global community with us, but we also don't leave people behind.
And fruit picking? What was the link there?
Well, I think the point, I'm not 100% sure, but I think the point was that we provide opportunities in our own industries for people in the Pacific Islands to be able to come and work here and be successful. And that's part of the economy of Australia, and we're going to keep advancing Australia's economy without leaving people behind.